Welcome to this community climate conversation event. My name is Cameron and I'll be your host this evening. We're very glad you're here virtually with us tonight, and we hope to have a pretty interactive conversation about Shoreline's climate action plan, what it is, why we're updating it, and get some feedback from you all to help set priorities and establish a vision for the plan. We are recording tonight's presentation so that we can make it available online for those who aren't able to attend here live with us. And as I mentioned, you are muted, but we will unmute later in the evening and have a chance to have some conversation. But the first part will be kind of more of a presentation, so we're keeping people muted, but please feel free to reach out via the chat, which should be at the should be a button at the top or bottom of your screen. There's a number of us here that can help troubleshoot tech difficulties, and yeah, we welcome the engagement. Before we dive in, I want to turn it over to Shoreline's Deputy Mayor, Keith Scully, to give a few opening remarks. So Deputy Mayor, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Reed. And I see my rather horrible picture up there too. So hopefully you can see me live. I see some familiar faces and some new faces on the list, which is fantastic. And I want to join Mr. Reed and the rest of the staff in welcoming you all. Deputy Mayor Scully. Mayor Hall unfortunately couldn't make it tonight. And I want to thank you all for being here tonight, for participating in this important conversation. And I wanted to open with a couple of words of hope, because when we talk about climate change, usually the words we start with are not hopeful. And for those of us who have been involved in this challenge for 10 or 20 years, you know that 10 or 20 years ago, we had to convince people that it was real. And we had to use photographs of starving polar bears, and we had to use statistics and extreme examples to try and convince a lot of the community that this is here and this is real and this is happening. And unfortunately today, we're not having those battles anymore, because we have wildfire smoke season here. We have declining salmon populations. We have critters as diverse as polar bears to pika changing their habits. And we've got some stuff going on that is obvious and that is significantly bad. We know this is real. But the message of hope is that one of the things we've done, and I think it's a mistake over the years, is pitch this as a binary problem. Either it's going to be climate change or it's going to be not climate change. And somehow, if we work a miracle, we'll get to not climate change. But in truth, it isn't binary. It's a thing that's ongoing. It's happening now. It's going to keep happening. But how bad it is, and how far-reaching the effects are, and how severe the impacts are, those things are controllable. And the changes we make, whether they be small or large or in between, make a difference in keeping this under control, keeping this not as bad as possible, and maybe someday stopping it and even reversing it. But even if we don't get there, even if we don't get to the aggressive goals that I'll talk about in a minute, we're all doing good work here. And the changes we make, the impacts we have, they're real and they matter. So we've set aggressive goals here in the city of Shoreline. We completed our first climate action plan in 2013, right before I was on council. And we committed at that time to reducing emissions by 50% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. On October 18th of this year, we got bolder and we voted to join the Race to Zero campaign and committed to achieving a 60% reduction of greenhouse gas emissions by 2030 and net zero emissions by 2050. Those are necessary goals, those are bold goals, but quite frankly, that's the easy part. Setting the goal, setting where we want to be, that's important, but it's not hard. The hardest part is implementing the changes necessary to get there. And another of the hardest parts is what we're going to do tonight, which is coming up with the details, the policy goals, the specific steps, the specific targets that help us reach those bold goals that we've implemented. I want to diverge for a minute and just say that I'm proud we've achieved one of the hardest parts, which is a reduction with actual impact recently. And that's to ban natural gas heating in multifamily dwellings. We had tremendous community support. Some of the names on the list in there were helpful in that. Staff was helpful, and council, we voted to make it happen. I'm glad we did that, but that's sort of the start of the bold changes we need to make and the bold changes you're going to help us outline for tonight. And I said it's a hard part, what we're doing tonight, because what we have to do is balance factors. We can't just say we're going to do this thing without taking account of whatever that thing is and what impact it has on others. We have to bear in mind that historically, the climate proposals haven't always been implemented equitably, and some populations have suffered more than others. We have to balance all of those things, all of the communities that have faced historic and current inequalities, because those are the ones that often bear the impact of it, while other communities reap the benefits without having to make the sacrifices. I'm hopeful that our conversation tonight will be focused on the things that we as a city can do. We're not the federal government, we're not the state government. Our largest impact is in building energy and transportation, which on a city level, as opposed to a regional or a state or a national level, those two things, building energy and transportation, are together 97% of our community's contribution. So if we can knock those back even a little bit, we've gone a little farther towards mitigating the impacts of this ongoing change. I'm going to be here with you tonight, but my job after I finish speaking in just a second is to listen and observe, not to participate. I want to thank you again for being here tonight, and I'm looking forward to listening in on the conversations and the necessary changes that will result from our work together tonight. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Deputy Mayor Scully. So if we could go to the next slide, Alicia. So you already met me. My name is Cameron Reed. I am the Environmental Program Specialist here at the City of Shoreline, and I'm the Project Manager for the Climate Action Plan. With me is Gretchen from Cascadia Consulting Group. And so she's leading our consultant team that is providing technical assistance to help with the Climate Action Plan. Gretchen will be our co-host tonight. You'll hear from her at multiple points. Also from Cascadia, we have Haley and Alicia. And from the City of Shoreline, we also have Suni and Bethany, whom some of you will meet during our breakout group conversations a little bit later. And with that, I'll turn it over to Gretchen.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cameron. And so I have the pleasure of talking through and giving everybody a snapshot of what's in store for tonight's workshop. And on the left-hand side of the screen, you'll see our workshop purposes. There are many. We've got an action-packed agenda and many purposes that we're looking to accomplish over the next couple of hours with you all. And the first one being gain familiarity with the Shoreline Climate Action Plan. And Cameron will get more in detail into that, what it is, what we're looking to accomplish with that effort, and all the various components to the Climate Action Plan. He'll also share some insights into Shoreline's progress to date. Shoreline has been a leader in the space for a long time, and so sharing with you all what has been happening in the city of Shoreline in terms of progress to date, and then also what still needs to happen, and where is that roadmap, where are we all headed as a group through this Climate Action Plan. Then we'll switch gears and we'll be gathering input from you all in terms of what your priorities are and how you would like the city to achieve the climate action goals that have been set forward. And then we'll close the night in terms of what's next and how you all can stay involved in this really important effort. And so in terms of the format for the night, the first portion of the workshop will be us sharing some project details with you all. And then the second half of the workshop will be us hearing from you all. And so we'll start out, as I mentioned, by talking about the Climate Action Plan, where it is, where Shoreline is now, what work has been done to date, and then looking forward, what work still needs to be done and how we plan to get there in terms of our roadmap for this project. Then we'll be heading into breakout rooms, so small group discussions where we'll begin to hear from you all in terms of setting a shared vision for the Shoreline Climate Action Plan, and then learning more, diving more deeply into your priorities and your interests so that we can capture those as part of this planning effort. We'll come back together as a full group for a report out across the breakout rooms, so you'll get to hear a snapshot of the conversations that happened in each of the breakout rooms, and then we'll close at 8 o'clock tonight. As I mentioned, we've got a packed couple of hours, so please take care of yourself throughout the workshop. If you need to stand up, if you need to take a stretch break, grab a glass of water, please do so at any time throughout our conversation together tonight. Go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So we all know we've been kind of at this for a while in terms of these online meetings, but tech doesn't always work the way we want it to. And so we have Brett Edgar, who is on point. He's on the call tonight, and he's also available to help you all with any and all issues that you may have navigating Zoom so that you can be as active of a participant in this conversation as you would like. Haley is putting his contact information in the chat. It's also up on the screen. Feel free to give him a call, send him an email, send him a text if you do need some support navigating any tech issues through the night. And with that, we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. So if you would just wouldn't mind taking a brief moment to rename yourself if you'd like. And we're looking for you to rename yourself with your first name and then the neighborhood in Shoreline that you live in. And you can do that by clicking on participants. You'll see the participant bar on the right-hand side of your screen, hovering over your name and then clicking the more button and then rename. And that should give you the option of renaming yourself with your first name and then with the neighborhood that you live in. Once you've had a chance to do that, we are also inviting you all via the chat function to finish this sentence for us. So looking outwardly and looking at 2015 and the city that you all live in and that you call home, what do you want Shoreline to look like? So please finish this sentence for us in the chat. In 2050, I want Shoreline to look like, and then you finish that sentence. And please put that in the chat. We've got from Deb from Highland Terrace, a friendly village. Other thoughts on what you want Shoreline to look like in 2050? From Ananda, an inclusive, tree-filled community. From Trina from Echo Lake, we've got full of pedestrian activity. From France, trees and clean air. From Pam, a welcoming green space with less hardscape than other areas. From Janice, a net zero city with high uses of electric vehicles, mass transit, buildings with vibrant green spaces. From Kathy, a leader and great example of those communities that are just beginning the climate planning process. From Bob and Maria, we've got walkable trees, trees, trees. From Lee, community shared solar. Andrea, solar and wind, sidewalks and trees, transit. From Diane, all people with food, housing, water, and community. Give folks about another minute. From Jessica, clean streams and creeks. Excellent. So a lot of good things in here. We've got habitat for both people and wildlife. Renowned for advanced climate preparation, green in all ways. From Todd, healthy people, places, greenscapes. And for those that haven't had a chance yet to finish the sentence, please keep the responses coming and we will capture all of this in the chat. Lots of really good vision for the city in the upcoming years. So thanks so much for sharing. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Cameron, who's going to do a deeper dive into the climate action planning process, what it is, and what this means for Shoreline.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Gretchen. So yeah, we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So what is the climate action plan? Why are we doing this? You know, probably preaching to the choir a little bit here, but as you know, and as you've heard from the deputy mayor, climate change is already impacting our community, our region, our country, and our planet in many ways, threatening ecosystems, infrastructure, and public health. But beyond the very serious global impacts of a climate breakdown, climate change is a threat to our community here and now. And here are just a few of the local impacts that we're already seeing, and I'm sure we have all experienced in one way or another recently. So with the increased global temperatures leading to more extreme heat days for us in the summer, and are also contributing to more frequent and catastrophic wildfires. The smoke from the wildfires can significantly impact us here in Shoreline with reduced air quality to unhealthy levels, which is especially harmful for those with existing respiratory issues. And we're also seeing more drought conditions in summer, and the hotter days increase the risk of heat-related illness and deaths, especially to those who are unhoused or who work outside. In the Northwest, we're also seeing less snow and more rain during our fall and winter seasons, and more intense short duration rainstorms. So while we don't have a major river system floodplain and shoreline like some of our neighbors to the north or in other parts of King County, we do have an increased risk of localized flooding from these short, higher intensity storms. And so these impacts and others are projected to get much worse in the coming years if we do not act now to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions from our activities. So that's why we're doing this. Next slide, please. And to protect our community from these impacts, we need to do 3 things in the climate action plan. First, we need to limit or stop activities that are producing greenhouse gases in the first place. So this is kind of what we typically think of with climate action. This is called mitigation. I like to think of it as turning off the tap, say that's filling up a bathtub. We need to stop the activities that are releasing these gases into the atmosphere and causing the climate change. And we'll take a closer look into where these emissions come from in Shoreline in a minute. It's primarily vehicles and natural gas use for our buildings, but we also have emissions related to the waste that we can consume and throw away. The second, we can capture carbon dioxide and remove it from the atmosphere using trees, other plants, soil, and natural systems. So this is called sequestration. I like to think of this as, pulling the plug and draining the bathtub. So, really literally removing excess carbon from the atmosphere and storing it for a time in forests and soil. There's also technological methods of removing carbon that we can look at. And last but not least, you have adaptation or resilience. So we need to protect and prepare our community for the impacts that we're already experiencing and those that are projected to come in the coming years. So we need a plan for things like bigger storms and hotter summer days with better stormwater infrastructure and cooling centers or more trees. So this, is called resilience, strengthening our ability to withstand the kind of hazards that come with climate change. So in our climate action plan, we need to include all 3. We can't just plant trees to capture carbon, and we can't just prepare. We also need to turn off that tap. Next slide, please. So yeah, as I mentioned, and as Deputy Mayor Scully mentioned, the climate action plan is really focused on key actions the city can take. So policies, programs that we can put in place. We can't do everything. We're not the federal government. We're not the state. Things need to happen at different levels. But we're also not just talking about individual actions. We're really talking about city actions. So what policies can we put in place as the city? We also know that climate change impacts certain communities disproportionately. So we need to make sure that the actions we are taking to address climate change are done equitably and include those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change in finding these solutions. So we often call these communities frontline communities because they're experiencing the impacts from climate change earlier or are less sheltered from the impacts. So in Shoreline, this could include communities of color, people with low or no income, unhoused individuals, youth, immigrants, people with disabilities, and those with limited English proficiency or other marginalized groups. So our CAP really needs to have a short-term focus. So we need to focus on the next 9 to 10 years, things that we can get done in this sort of immediate time frame. But we also want to set ourselves up to completely decarbonize and achieve net zero emissions by 2050. Next slide, please. And so where do we need to go? How much do we need to reduce our emissions to prevent the worst consequences of climate change? As the Deputy Mayor mentioned, the Shoreline City Council voted last month to join the Cities Race to Zero campaign. So this is a UN-backed group of cities that are all making commitments to reduce their fair share of global climate emissions to the level needed to prevent or to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, which is the level recommended by the Paris Climate Agreement. And by joining that campaign, we received updated targets based on the best available science that show how much the shoreline community needs to reduce emissions to do our part in limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. So you can see here on the graph, the 2019 column is where we're at. The 2030 goal represents a 60% reduction. And then 2050, there's nothing there. So by 2050, we need to be either at zero emissions or net zero, meaning that we have offset or we're doing sequestration activities to offset any remaining emissions, no later than 2050. So these are very ambitious goals, but they do reflect the reductions we need to achieve if we're serious about keeping global warming to 1.5 degrees and doing our fair share of the Paris Climate Agreement. And so before I continue, let's do another quick poll, just to do a quick pulse read. So you should be seeing a little quiz pop up on your screen here in just a moment. And we'd like you to answer, how important is it to you that the city of Shoreline is working on this, that we take action on climate change? And we'll give people just about a minute here on the poll. Is everybody seeing that okay?
I can see it, but I can't vote. I don't know if anyone else is having the same issue.
That might be because you're a co-host.
It looks like, Cameron, that other folks are having the same issue with voting.
This is Brent. I'm not sure if it was Alicia or somebody else that launched the poll. You may have to relaunch the poll and clear out the results.
Sorry about that. We'll relaunch it here. How about now?
There we go.
Perfect. Awesome. Give people just 30 seconds. Thank you, guys. Wouldn't be a Zoom meeting without technical difficulties. Awesome. Great. Just 5 more seconds. And we can go ahead and end that and share out the results. Thank you for sharing what you think. And let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So how are we doing? We saw where we need to go. How are we doing so far? What progress have we made to date? Next slide, please. So we mentioned Shoreline has really been a leader working in this, working to plan for and address climate change in our region, especially compared to other similar sized cities like Burien, Richmond, or Olympia. So you can see on the left are a number of different greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So we completed our first one in 2009, our first climate action plan in 2013. And since then, we've completed 2 other inventories, most recently in 2019, and a carbon wedge analysis back in 2015. And our community has also been a leader in taking some bold and strategic actions. Most notably, we've worked to focus urban growth in areas served by transit, such as the coming light rail stations and the Aurora corridor. This is a key action that will significantly reduce the transportation emissions of the people who live in those areas. We've also required that new development in the station areas meet high green building standards, which will further reduce the emissions of the people living in those buildings. We have one of the most successful green building programs in the region. We've added over 680 high efficiency green certified residential units and 904,000 square feet of green certified commercial space over the past few years. We're also making investments in our alternative transportation network, so working to add new sidewalks and bike lanes in the recent years. We're investing in our urban forest, so we created a dedicated urban forester position in 2016 to better lead stewardship of our urban tree canopy. We're working to maintain and restore healthy forests in our parks and right-of-ways. Just this past month, we worked with community volunteers to plant over 1,300 trees in active restoration sites at 4 parks through the Green Shoreline Partnership. And we've also done a good job as a community at recycling and composting our waste. So reducing the amount we send to landfill, and we've increased access to those services to more people in our community. Next slide, please. And all of this progress has been made possible by your extensive advocacy and support for environmental stewardship and climate action. So thinking of longstanding events like the Northwest Solar Fest or grassroots work by groups like Digging Shoreline or Climate Action Shoreline, and the recent student climate strikes as well. And all of these, the Shoreline community has demonstrated commitment and support for taking bold action to address climate change. Next slide, please. We're also working together collaboratively with other communities in our region through the K4C, the King County Cities Climate Collaborative. It's a partnership of 18 cities and the county working together to leverage our resources and collective influence and really looking for regional solutions to climate change. And Shoreline has been on the forefront of these efforts and is working to move the region forward to decarbonize and prepare for climate impacts. Next slide, please. So now, where has all this gotten us? What progress have we made in terms of the numbers of emissions? So we just completed an inventory of our 2019 emissions. We wanted to choose 2019 because 2020 was such an unprecedented year, and because there's long lag times for the data needed to conduct these inventories. And as you can see in the graph, we have had a 5% decrease. So the bottom bar there is the 2009 emissions, and the upper bar is the 2019 emissions. So we've had a 5% decrease since 2009. And this is despite a growing population. So we have a lower per capita emissions. Our vehicles have become more fuel efficient and more electric. So the average amount we're driving has gone down, despite adding more people and more cars to the community. We've also made good progress in solid waste, as I mentioned, through recycling and composting. So that was a big reduction as well. But as you can see, the blue bar and the green bar, which represent transportation fuel use and building energy, remain the two biggest sources of Shoreline's emissions. So you can click one or two more times there. So despite this progress, we are not on track to meet our targets, not our current targets, which are the 50% reduction by 2030 and 80% by 2050, or the new targets we just committed to through the Race to Zero, which you can see by the stars there. So they're even more aggressive. In this graph, the blue shaded area represents the level of emissions we needed to hit for our previous targets. So let's go one more slide. So taking a closer look here at 2019, you can really see the impact of the transportation of our driving gas and diesel vehicles, which are, what is that, 56%. And then the using natural gas to heat our homes and businesses, so which is 38% of Shoreline's emissions in 2019. And together, those two categories alone make up 94% of Shoreline's emissions. So just a huge, far and away the biggest categories. And so we know where we need to focus. We'll need to focus on natural gas use in buildings and decarbonizing our transportation. And by comparison, we have the benefit in Shoreline of having access to very clean electricity from Seattle City Light hydropower. So the electricity we receive in Shoreline is essentially carbon-free and net zero emissions already. So we know we're going to need to focus on these other big chunks of the grass. So how are we going to do this? And that's where the new climate action plan will come in to provide a roadmap to focusing on emissions reductions in those areas. And I will turn it over to Gretchen here to talk about the process of updating the plan.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Cameron. Yeah, so you heard from Cameron about what will be captured in the climate action plan. And I'm sure you all are on the edge of your seats wondering how we're going to get there, right? So what does this mean to me? What does this mean to the community of Shoreline? And how are we going to get there? And so you will see by the next slide here, this is our roadmap for getting you all there. And there are 3 different phases. And I'm going to walk briefly through each of the 3 phases. You'll also see that there are a couple of boxes on there that capture some of the technical work that's going to be happening while we're working our way through each of these 3 project phases. So we're currently in phase 1, and the goal of phase 1 is building awareness and building awareness about the project, and then better understanding community priorities. And tonight's workshop is an integral part of phase 1. And in early 2022, we'll be moving into the project's second phase, or phase 2. So as we're going along this timeline here. And during phase 2, we'll be hosting 5 community conversations where we will work with you all and others from the community to collaboratively develop strategies and actions for the climate action plan. And then that puts us into late spring, early summer, which will begin phase 3. And phase 3 is when we will release the draft of the climate action plan. And during this phase, we'll be hosting our final, so the 7th of 7 community conversations, and we'll be soliciting your input on the draft plan. And as I mentioned from the start of looking at this roadmap together tonight, we will also be doing technical work that's going on throughout all these phases. During phase 1, we're developing a wedge analysis to estimate greenhouse gas reductions based on a variety of different scenarios. And we'll also be working on a carbon sequestration analysis to estimate the potential of Shoreline's urban forests to capture and store carbon. And then through all 3 of the phases, we'll be working on the multi-criteria analysis to assess identified actions, as well as a cost assessment to identify the costs associated with implementing climate action plan actions and strategies. So that's our timeline. Those are our 3 phases, as well as the overlay of technical work that will be feeding into the community conversations that we'll be having with you all throughout the course of this project. And with that, we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. You've just heard a lot from us. You've heard a lot from Cameron in terms of what the climate action plan is and what are the various components, what is the beginnings of what Shoreline's baseline looks like, what Shoreline has accomplished to date, where it needs to head, what the goals are related to the race to zero, as well as regional collaborations. And so we're wanting to pause for just a few minutes here and answer any questions that you all may have, either about the process, about the climate action plan itself, about the various phases that we'll be undergoing throughout the course of the next several months together, or about the workshop. So any questions you may have, please put them in the chat. And then if you happen to have called in and aren't able to enable chat, please feel free to raise your hand and we can call on you that way. But any questions about the process, about any of the things that we've talked about so far tonight? Great, we've got a question here from Todd from Richmond Highlands. When talking about costs, will numbers be put forward to explain the costs of inaction? Do either Cameron or Andrea want to take that one?
That's a great question. I might defer, if Andrea has any experience from other communities. I know we are prepared to run cost analysis for the final list of actions for some of the key actions that come out of the climate action plan. So, the cost, because we need to figure out what's feasible for us to implement. But yeah, I'm not sure. We haven't talked about, coming up with some ballpark figures in terms of what this would mean in terms of cost to our community. But that's a great thought. Andrea, anything to add with that?
Sure, yeah. As part of this process, we are planning to do a cost benefit analysis. That analysis is more meant to compare costs between the different action options. And so it does not take into account the cost of an action, or rather the benefits of action, because it assumes, the city is going to take an action. It's just a matter of which actions to take. But that being said, I think the cost of an action is really important as a communication tool, especially just to emphasize that the cost and benefit analysis that we would be doing is not telling the whole story, right? There are these costs of inaction that are real, that will be realized if the city does not take action to address these emissions. And so there are ways we can look at that as part of the climate action planning process. There are estimates kind of broadly for the region on costs of inaction. We've worked with other cities, recently the city of Tacoma, on doing more thorough cost of inaction analysis, so we could bring some of those in to help tell that story as part of the climate action plan.
Great. Thanks, Cameron, and thanks, Andrea. The next question we have is from Betsy from Parkwood. Curious about coordination with developers, environmental impact studies, traffic studies, et cetera. Cameron, want to take that?
Sure, I can try. Yeah, I mean, it's a huge thing. Like, obviously our community is developing and changing a lot. And as I mentioned, some of the goals of that was related to climate, to really reduce, especially the transportation impact and the building energy impact of people living near light rail and commuting on light rail. But yeah, I mean, this is an issue we're obviously going to continue to be working on. I know our stormwater folks are very sensitive to this and looking at the infrastructure needs in areas of our community that are developing. Yeah, so I don't know what else to add, just that it's definitely something we're thinking about. And we have a lot of the levers in our control relate to the development code and the building code. So it's definitely, when we think about implementing more policies and actions that are conducive to reducing emissions, that we definitely would focus on development.
Great. And Andrea, anything more you wanted to add to that? Okay, great. And the next question that we have is from Lee from Briarcrest. Are we just addressing city operations emissions tonight, or whole community emissions?
Thank you so much for asking that. I totally forgot to mention that. These are community-wide emissions. So we're not talking just about the city's emissions. I forget the exact stat, but it's just like 1%, if that, of the overall community emissions. So all the data I just presented and what we're talking about in terms of targets for that 60% and net zero, that's for the Shoreline community as a whole. And it comes from what we call our direct emissions, which are primarily it's things that we have direct control over. So it's things like driving, waste we produce, the electricity and the utilities that we consume, the energy used to convey all those utilities. But it doesn't include the emissions associated with producing the goods that we consume or the food that we consume. So that's sort of outside of the scope of what we can easily measure, but that there are definitely emissions associated with that. But yeah, so we're not just talking about the city's operational impacts. We're talking about the whole Shoreline community's footprint, essentially.
Thanks, Cameron. All right, we've got a few other questions in here. The next one from Pam from Hillwood. Is Shoreline working with Seattle City Light to protect our city from more rate increases? And in particular, talking about the change from electric to natural gas and increasing of rates.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great concern to bring up because as you saw, we know that one of our biggest categories in terms of things we can do to reduce emissions is working to remove natural gas from heating systems for our buildings. And so as the deputy mayor mentioned, we're working on that with the commercial side, but we also need to address the residential side. We know that currently electricity, especially on baseboard or more inefficient heating systems, is going to be a lot more expensive. So we definitely need to be thinking about that and pairing it with efficiency measures. But yeah, I think that's a great point, and thanks for bringing that forward.
Great. Yeah, and that's something when we get into strategies and actions, we'll be diving more deeply into things like incentives and ways to help move some of these strategies and actions forward in an equitable way. So we've got time for a couple more questions here. Anna from North City. What are your current community outreach methods to make sure community members are aware of these meetings? And how are you reaching out to frontline underserved communities to make sure that those most impacted are having their voices heard? through this process?
Thanks, Anna. That's an excellent question. So currently not as much as I would like, but yeah, we started earlier this year. We recruited a group of community climate advisors, specifically from diverse backgrounds, for some of those identities that we thought in our community would be more reflective of people who would be disproportionately impacted by climate change. And so we have some of them on the call here tonight. But we've been working with them for a couple of months, developing our outreach strategy and running a lot of this material by them. And we'll also continue to meet with them throughout this process to get sort of like specific input on that. But, you know, asking specifically about, you know, we realize a Zoom event in an evening isn't going to be accessible to everybody. So yeah, definitely aware that we need to do more and get more creative in terms of reaching people right now, especially with it being winter and the pandemic. But yeah, we're working to develop some materials in language and potentially like a sort of paper poster board version of this material that we can take to different community centers that can be sort of a passive interactive thing for community members who are already, you know, accessing services at those locations. So that's one of the strategies we're looking at. We're also looking at partnering with some youth and student groups to host youth-specific events, especially for youth of color.
Thanks, Cameron. And we have a couple of suggestions from Betsy in the chat in terms of outreaching to schools, the community college, and volunteer recruitment as well. All right, we have time for 2 more questions from the chat. We've got one from Andrea from Richmond Beach. And are all these new and planned large residential developments required to be all electric? Do you know the answer to that, Cameron? Okay.
Yeah, so as Deputy Mayor Scully alluded to, I believe the ordinance we have been working on some building energy code updates that would prohibit the use of fossil fuels in space and water heating for new commercial construction. So that will be officially passed, should council pass it next week, I believe. Currently, yeah, so that will take care of a large chunk of that. It also has a ton of efficiency measures in it. It's based off of the Seattle Energy Code, which is way much more stringent than ours. And yeah, but beyond that, we also have the green building mandate that I mentioned, which applies to developments that have been going up in the station sub areas. So those have to meet some levels of green building certification, which are mostly around efficiency, but they also have things like, you know, stormwater, water quality protection, stuff like that. So moving forward, should this ordinance pass next week, all new commercial buildings and retrofit and replacements of heating systems will have to be all electric.
Thanks, Cameron. Then we have a couple of comments in the chat related to trees. So just noting that as well. And then final question in here is related to from Kami from Highland Terrace. Do you have an estimate of how many Shoreline residents are willing to take action at this point?
That's a great question. I don't have good data. We haven't done like a huge, just statistically significant survey. We do have just a small survey that asks some of the same questions we're asking here tonight that's posted online. But yeah, I'd have to look back and see the last time we did like a statistically significant survey on that.
Thank you. And then Andrea added something related to the cost of inaction in the chat. So consideration of the social cost of carbon could also be a tool to assess the cost of inaction. The planning process will include a quantitative analysis to estimate projected greenhouse gas emissions reductions from identified actions. Thanks for adding that additional piece. And with that, we are going to close the Q&A portion of the night. We have time. We're about to head into the breakout rooms and a lot of great discussion in a smaller group setting before we come back together as a full group. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Cameron, and we can go to the next slide, please. Thank you all for your great questions and points.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Gretchen. And yeah, but please keep these questions coming. These are great questions, and I'll do my best to follow up here after the event. But we will move on for the sake of time. So we're going to shift gears slightly to enter the more interactive portion. You've heard a lot from us, and now we'd like to hear from you. And we're also going to shift gears a bit. So instead of really diving in and thinking about the specific actions and policies, you know, we've been thinking about, we've seen the pie wedge, we've been thinking about where our emissions come from, but we're going to step back from that a little bit. And we want to think about, we want to hear from you what our priorities should be with this plan, and to really set a vision to guide us as we start to hash out those specifics, which, as Gretchen mentioned, we'll do in a series of workshops in the new year. And we'll dive into each category. We'll talk about trees and sequestration. We'll talk about buildings. We'll talk about transportation, and we'll do a really deep dive on all the potential actions we could look at. So stay tuned for more information on that. But for now, we want to stay really big picture and just talk about what are our criteria going to be that are going to help guide us as we choose which actions to take over the next 9 to 10 years. So with that, we can go to the next slide. And so we're going to do this first one's a Zoom poll, and I'll provide a little bit of context for it, and then we'll transition to breakout rooms. You'll be in there for a good chunk of time. We may not need all of the time. And then we will transition back to the main group and share out. So next slide, please. Okay, so the first, to provide just a little bit of context here, we want to set some priorities that will help guide us as we choose the actions to include in the CAP in the coming months. We know we can't do everything. We have limited time and budget, so we really need to narrow down to the list of actions that's going to be the most impact, but also aligns the best with our community values. And we know that our actions will have to reduce emissions. They'll have to be cost effective. It has to be stuff that's actually in our scope that we as the city can control. But there's a whole bunch of other criteria that we could use to help us prioritize these actions. So the list here are some examples that are commonly used. In some of these, you could consider co-benefits. So for example, an example of a co-benefit, say you're buying an electric car or electric vehicle. So electric vehicle doesn't just reduce emissions, it also provides you with some long-term cost savings from lower fuel and maintenance costs. So the co-benefit there would be cost savings. It also is reducing emissions, but if cost savings is very important to you, then we can include that as a criteria so that we're prioritizing as a city, we're prioritizing actions that have cost savings associated with them as a co-benefit. So that's just one example. And we can go to the next slide here. So here's a little bit more definition around these are some criteria we're looking at. So one would be public health. So an action that reduces emissions, but also protects public health. Another one is climate resiliency. So there's some actions that kind of cross those different Venn diagram bubbles I shared. So trees is a great example. It helps sequester carbon and it provides relief and shade from hotter summer days. Job creation. So some things we can do to reduce emissions will also stimulate the economy or provide green jobs. So that's another criteria we could use. Justice and equity. So making sure that an action also addresses current or historic disparity. Or there could be ecosystem health benefits or sort of other environmental benefits or cost savings, as I mentioned. So, something like an electric car or doing, weatherizing, home weatherization program would also save people money. So it's not all inclusive. So if something you think is very important isn't listed there, please mark, there will be an other option on the poll. So click other and then type into chat what your criteria you would like to see added to this list. So with that, we want to know which two of the following factors are most important for the city to consider when evaluating actions to include in the CAP. So you can go ahead, Alicia, and launch the poll. So is that poll showing up for everybody?
I see it, but I don't see anybody voting yet. Oh, there's a vote, so it must be working. Perfect.
And are people able to select 2 options or just 1? Okay, let's look at that really quick. Well, you'll have to be even more selective. So pick your top one in the poll, and then we're just gonna type your second one into the chat, and we'll collect those via the chat. So sorry about that. So pick your top option, or you know, they can be equal. Pick one of them in the poll, and then put your second one in the chat. And again, if your priority isn't really reflected here, please mark other and type it into the chat. It sounds like some people might have been allowed to click too, so not sure what's going on there. And we'll give you about another 30 seconds or so, unless you need more time. Thank you to those of you who have voted. I think we're waiting on just two more people. We'll give you 15 seconds here. All right. I think with that, we can, I think we can close the poll and we can share those results out. And if for some reason I missed you, please leave it in the chat. Thank you so much. Yeah, so we see some themes emerging. And so we will use this feedback to help shape our criteria that we're going to take into the next phase as we do these deep dives and build that action list. We'll use this feedback. We'll use feedback from our community climate advisors to shape the criteria that the city will use to evaluate the action. So thank you very much for providing this feedback. And with that, I think I'm turning it back over to Gretchen here.
Sounds great. Okay, thank you so much, Cameron. So getting us all set up here for the breakout rooms. In just a moment, you all will be whisked away into a breakout room with a pre-assigned facilitator who will be walking through a set of 3 questions. And there are about 5 people per room, so lots of time for good discussion, and also we'll be capturing your input we're using an online platform called Mural. So we'll be sharing our screen when we get into those breakout rooms, capturing your input on little virtual sticky notes as we walk through the set of 3 questions. And then we'll be in these breakout rooms. And again, across each of the breakout rooms, we're going to be in close communication in terms of how much time you all are needing for each of the questions. We've estimated approximately about 50 minutes in the breakout rooms before we then come back into the main room. And each of the facilitators will do a quick report out just so that you all have the opportunity to hear what was discussed in the other rooms. And then we will move on to the next agenda item after we do the full group report out and get back into the main room together. And we can go ahead and go to the next slide, please. We've got 3 discussion questions that we'll be walking through, that your facilitators will be walking through. And as Cameron mentioned, these are all questions that are really helping us better understand your priorities, your vision, what you see, what you would like to see in the city of Shoreline, and how we keep those community priorities front and center as we walk through each of the phases of the community action plan development. So first question that we'll be hearing from you all on is, what do you love about Shoreline that you want to see continue in the future? And so this is really your shared, your lived experience, and helping us capture your lived experience about living in Shoreline and what you really want to make sure continues into the future. The second question that we'll be diving into and hearing from you all on is, what are some challenges of living in Shoreline, or what would you like to see more of in Shoreline in the future? So that's the second question. And the third question is, when you think about the local and near-term impacts of climate change in our community, like flooding, like extreme heat, wildfire smoke, what aspects of our community are you most concerned about and why? And are there other community concerns that you'd like to add? So we've captured a few community concerns, and what we're going to be asking from you all is, are there any beyond the ones that we've captured that you want to be sure that we capture as part of our process and as part of future conversations? And with that, I'm going to pause for just a moment before we head into the breakout rooms. Again, a reminder, recognizing that we have you for 2 hours. You all have very busy lives and are giving up a chunk of your evening to be with us and have this important conversation. But if you need to grab water, please, if you need a stretch break, please do so. Any questions on the questions before we head into our we're randomly assigning breakout rooms. So you'll be heading into those in just a moment. Any questions on the questions? All right, so with that, you should in just a moment see on your screen that you are heading into a breakout room. And so Brett, let us know when that's ready.
Yeah, it's happening right now. Just to let you know, you now have the ability to unmute yourself. So when you get in there, unmute yourself, turn on your camera, and have a great time. Here you go.
Great. Welcome back, everybody. Looks like we've got everybody back from each of the breakout rooms. We are going to, recognizing that each of you all had a mini conversation with a handful of other folks from the Shoreline community. And now we're going to get a chance to hear from each of the facilitators and a brief capture of the highlights of that conversation, some of the themes that came out of that conversation. So you'll get to hear from the other breakout rooms and the kind of the threads of commonality and maybe some of the differences across the breakout rooms. And with that, I will go to breakout room 1. Cameron.
All right, thanks so much, Gretchen, and thanks to my group. We had some great conversation and thoughts thrown out. Gretchen, are we sharing the boards or just verbally?
Just verbally, I think is fine. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Yeah. So some of the common themes I heard, and apologies, I won't be able to capture everything, but we love that the city and council and community had taken some forward-looking actions, both in the past and currently, and that, such as the natural gas ban for new construction. People were really excited to see that leadership. We loved our parks, green spaces, and trees. We wanted more walkability, more tree protection, and just a cleaner city. And in terms of concerns, when we think about climate impacts, we're definitely concerned about public health and the well-being of future generations, but also needed to be conscious of costs and making solutions affordable and accessible to especially people with lower incomes or not as much access to, install solar panels or something.
Excellent.
That's my group.
Great. Thank you so much, Cameron, and thanks, group 1. Now we're going to move over to breakout room 2 and Bethany.
All right, thank you. And we went to the very last end and even got cut off. So kudos to my group for hanging in there the entire time. We heard a lot of some similar comments in our group as well. What do we love about Shoreline? What do they love about Shoreline? Green spaces, trees. They also spoke about that there are good communication from the city and that they feel that their voices are heard, and good institutions. And that includes the city and the schools. And I think one person commented, came for the school, stayed for the trees. In terms of some of the challenges of living in Shoreline or what they would like to see more of, sometimes I feel like there's a resistance to change, and I'd like to see some increased diversity and increased visibility of folks, so they appreciate the ways that the city is working on those issues. And we also need increased walkability and increased food diversity and access. And in terms of kind of, I guess, just a wrap up of the summary is appreciate that the community and increase or institutions, the quality of life and the green spaces that are in Shoreline. And we want to see increased protection of those resources and increased sustainability going forward.
Excellent. Thanks so much for sharing out, Bethany, and to group 2 for the conversation. And now we'll head over to room 3 and Suni.
Great. We also had similar to group 1 and group 2. So what do you love about Shoreline? The trees, neighbors, and the care that our community shows for one another and the environment. Number 2, what challenges or what would you like to see more of in Shoreline? Again, continuing what they love, which is caring for what exists in public spaces. And the last question about what are the topics, the near-term impacts of climate change. Definitely the top one around natural ecosystems and habitats, but also a lot of great conversation around supporting equity and health, community programs, support for youth voice, and our Shoreline city infrastructure.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Suni. And I believe we're going to take off the spotlight just so we see everybody's faces here and head over to breakout room 5. Breakout room 4 is not forgotten. That's my room. We're going to go to 5, then 6, and then back to 4. So breakout room 5 from Alicia.
Great, thank you. Well, again, a lot of the same themes with what my breakout group loves about Shoreline, including being the land of the trees with great forest reserves and parks, school districts, and the responsiveness of the city. And then some of the themes that came up for what folks would like to see more of and what some of the big concerns are included ease of access for actions, and especially regarding transportation. Someone in my group just said, if it's easy, it'll get used. So making sure that solutions are easy to access. And that also includes Shoreline being more pedestrian and bike friendly. And then there was also a big theme that we need to do things that support Shoreline's next generations and frontline communities and vulnerable populations. So I'll leave it there for now. There was lots of good conversation. So thank you all.
Great. Thanks so much, Alicia. And thank you, breakout room 5. And heading over to Haley and breakout room 6.
Thanks, Gretchen. Like everybody else, we heard a lot of very similar things in terms of what our folks love about Shoreline. My group particularly thought Shoreline was doing a really great job in terms of climate change action and education, and really loved how the city does a lot of community actions like weekly classes, webinars, and there was some specific support that says Cameron's doing a really great job. Our group also loved trees and green spaces, how much of that there is in Shoreline, and then the sense of community, as well as the walkable ability in Shoreline, but they do want more. And then for discussion question 2 of what you would love to see more or to see change would be reduction of waste, especially in restaurants, compost, plastic, etc. More walkability, more education surrounding electrification and resources, as well as a change in mindset, habits, and actions, the way residents actually are living. Lastly, they wanted to increase urban density through the city's power to change zoning. And then for the third discussion question, there was a big emphasis on economic vitality, looking at making sure that new green jobs are effective, because without effective green jobs, there'll be no change, as well as making sure ecosystems are kept healthy and creating resilience of public health and infrastructure. And then lastly, looking at property values and making sure we're not using tax dollars to make unsustainable choices like replicating infrastructure that's built in vulnerable areas just because it has a higher property value.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Breakout Room 6, and also Haley for the recap of the conversation. And so we'll head over to my group, group 4. And again, lots of similar themes across each of the discussion questions. A lot of talk for question 1 about the importance of nature and the green spaces and open spaces that Shoreline does have, peaceful coexistence, parks, and then also a lot of talk about the importance of maintaining the community connections and health and vitality of communities within the city of Shoreline. For question 2, in terms of challenges or what my group would like to see more of in the future, recognizing that there is walkability, but not everywhere. There is bikeability, but not everywhere. So increasing the walkability and bikeability across the city, and with particular focus on some of the areas that are less bikeable, less walkable. And same goes for kind of access to basic necessities as well. Some parts of the community are very close to community centers. Other parts of the city are less close. So thinking about that as well. And then the group also talked about kind of the importance and needing more of addressing kind of this inclusive engagement and more voices around the table. And then that cost is also a significant barrier kind of across the board in terms of making Shoreline livable. And then for question 3, and thinking about aspects of the community most concerned about and why. So our group spent a lot of time kind of looking across all the various community concerns that we pre-populated and brought forward to you all for consideration, and recognizing the interconnectedness of all the concerns, that it was hard to talk about one concern without talking about the other concern, and that they truly are interconnected and need to be looked at as a whole system. And we also spent a chunk of time talking about public infrastructure and the impacts on public infrastructure with these extreme events, and then the importance of engaging and hearing directly from seniors and vulnerable populations in terms of what their concerns are as it relates to climate change. And then we also spent a few minutes talking about the importance of natural ecosystems and impacts on climate change there. So thank you all so much for hearing. I know it's great to have kind of these deeper dives with a small group of people, but also really nice to hear some of the common threads across all the groups, that priorities and concerns that you all share, and then the areas of some differences too in terms of what you all talked about in each of the groups. And with that, we are going to transition now into our last slide of the night, which is really what comes next. So just wanting to thank you all for being here tonight, recognizing you all are busy people, have a lot going on in your lives, and especially in the evenings. When it got dark, I guess 3 hours ago or something like that. So thank you all so much for being here. Just going to do a quick recap of the discussion for the night and what we set out to accomplish together, and what we did accomplish together in terms of we all gained a kind of collective familiarity with the Shoreline Climate Action Plan and the various project elements and what's to come on that. We also gained insights into Shoreline's progress to date. So Shoreline has been a leader in this space, recognizing and wanting to celebrate that, but also recognizing that there's more work to be done, and that this climate action plan plans to help get you there and collectively develop this plan together. And then we also gathered input from all of you in terms of what was important to you, what the community priorities are for how to achieve the city's climate goals. And recognizing this is the start of several months of conversations that we'll be having. And as you see on the slide here, some of the immediate next steps will be summarizing all of the great conversation that happened both in each of the breakout rooms, coming up with kind of common themes and threads, and summarizing this workshop into a meeting summary that will be posted on the website, recognizing that not everybody was able to be here tonight. So we'll also be posting the recording of the presentation portion of this up on the website as well. So feel free and encourage you all to circulate the link to the project website website and help us get the word out more about the climate action plan and what we're setting out to do together as a full community. Checking out the website for any updates on the project. So you'll see, and Haley's about to put the link into the website in the chat in just a second. You'll be able to find out more information about future workshops. There's also a link that gets you signed up for project updates. So Cameron will be sending regular project updates about our efforts on this front. And so getting your name signed up for that. And then there is a link to a survey as well, which is also going to help inform our process too. And in terms of moving into phase 2 for this project, phase 2 really gets started in January. So just around the corner, which is kind of crazy to imagine. It's November 30th already. We'll be hosting a series of 5 workshops starting in February that will be topic deep dives, and look forward to engaging with you all during those series of workshops. And then also a reminder that in early summer, there will be a workshop to review the draft action list that you all come up with during those topic deep dives. And with that, I am going to turn it over to Cameron for final closing remarks, and want to thank you all so much for being here and look forward to engaging with you all in the upcoming months. Cameron? Final thoughts?
Yeah, just echo what Gretchen said. Thank you all so much for being here tonight. Really appreciate it. This was a long event on Zoom, so take a break, take some screen time break. But yeah, just thank you so much for all your participation and feedback. And yeah, stay tuned. Please feel free to send me any additional feedback, anything related to the climate action plan, or any ideas and anything you weren't able to share tonight. So huge thank you all, and stay tuned for more information about our upcoming series in the new year. So have a great night, everybody.
Thank you.